watching the work of the special rapporteurs following up on their presentations at the UN Human Rights Council. And you have recently presented, again, just last week, I believe it was, your report. Was it your final report? Can you tell us a little bit what was in this report?
Yes, certainly. Yes, so the report this time built upon that which was established in previous reports. In other words, I have presented thematic reports on various subjects, including big data and open data, quite detailed recommendations also on health data, a report on privacy and gender, and this time round, the report focused on two main subjects. One was on privacy and children, and the other on privacy and AI. Both of them very important subjects, but as you know, we have...
Right now, it's like, finally, the conversation is really coming to the right fora, right? A few years back, maybe not even 3 or 4 years ago, journalists would comment on those issues online, you know, and academics as well, and nobody would respond. But now it's clear. And even President Biden this past week mentioned something about, you know, the platforms, how they are using, you know, new technologies in ways that are not conducive to supporting democracies. So tell us a little bit. You have been appointed special rapporteur for the right to privacy since 2015. What in this period of time have you realized are the main thrusts, the main issues that have to be brought to the table, to the negotiating table, within the context of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights?
Well, it's not only within the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, but within the UN system as a whole. And I immediately established 5 priorities, and those 5 priorities were security and privacy. They were health data and privacy. They were privacy, a better understanding of privacy. I'll explain that in a minute. And also big data and open data, and also the use of personal data by corporations. So what I did as soon as I identified each of these areas as priorities and stated publicly that these would be the priorities for my tenure was that in most of these key priority areas, I established a task force. In other words, I wanted the work to be as representative as possible of all the regions of the UN. So I invited various experts from around the world to join these task forces. As a result, we developed a methodology, and that methodology was to, in each of the subjects that I have mentioned, to first carry out consultations within the task force, and then publish those consultations for online consultations so that anybody could chip in, whether academics or governments or NGOs or whoever, and then also hold an in-person consultation, right? Normally, this would be a workshop conference during which we would examine the subject further. So what happened was that by 2017 and then again 2018, we published the results of the first working group task force, and that was big data and open data. Then we moved on to quite a major work, which was the publication of the work on health-related data. So that, just to give you an idea, the full text of that runs into over 40 pages, and there are another 40 pages of explanatory memorandum complete with recommendations on health-related data. Then again, we had, when it came to gender and privacy, I also carried out a consultation and which also included a meeting in New York. So I should add that the work on big data and open data included an in-person consultation in Australia, in Sydney, in 2018, July 2018. The consultation, the online consultation on health data was followed with an in-person consultation co-hosted with the Council of Europe in Strasbourg in June of 2019. And the consultation on gender was also followed by an in-person consultation in October of 2019 in New York. Unfortunately, in 2020, we had COVID, so we couldn't really continue holding in-person consultations, but we continued with the online consultations, and those led to the work on children and privacy, which we've just published in February, March of 2021, and also AI and privacy. I should say that AI and privacy came out of the working group on the task force on corporations. So that was something which I worked with the major tech corporations.
Which ones were you working with?
These included Google, Facebook, Deutsche Telekom, and a number of others, right? The whole approach has been to try and get as much discussion going. When it comes to security, I should remind viewers of this interview that the whole mandate, my mandate, was born, and I became Special Rapporteur because of the whole hoo-ha that arose about surveillance. In other words, in 2013, in June 2013, that's 8 years ago already, there were the first of what would be a series of ongoing revelations by the US whistleblower Edward Snowden. And after that, the debate in the UN led to the creation of the mandate in 2015, and I was appointed in 2015. I have worked very hard on that part of the mandate too. One of the things that was immediately noticeable was the lack of discussion and dialogue on the subject amongst a number of countries. So I proposed and set up what we called the International Intelligence Oversight Forum, IIOF. Now, this is particularly important because intelligence exists, but the protection of privacy must be resident in the law and the institutions created by law to oversee that intelligence. And the governance of such systems is therefore extremely important. Having identified that from the first day almost, in 2016, within a year of being appointed, we're already organizing the first IIOF. So that in that forum, which was hosted by the Parliament of Romania in Bucharest, we brought together as many of the oversight organizations as possible. I should explain that oversight organizations can either be parliamentary committees, but they can also be independent authorities in countries like France, the UK, the Netherlands. In addition to parliamentary scrutiny, there's also an independent expert.
So these are ad hoc committees or commissions of sorts.
Well, it would be
only for the period of
it would be
examining the issue.
So in several countries, not enough, nowhere near enough. In a few countries, I should say, in addition to the parliamentary committees, to the standing or ad hoc committee of the parliament of that country, they would also have an expert full-time organization, which could have a mixed composition of technical experts, legal experts and judges, and also domain experts, ex-intelligence agencies, ex-police personnel, who would together carry out oversight, both ex post and ex ante, of all surveillance activities. So what we did in the mandate was to increase the dialogue going on between these different entities so that good practices could be passed on, and thus both democracy and privacy would be better served. The next meeting in 2017 was hosted by Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg in Brussels. The third IIOF was hosted in my home country in Malta by the Parliament of Malta. The fourth IIOF was hosted by the UK government in Lancaster House in London. It was a huge success too, but that was October 2019. Then comes 2020, and bang went IIOF, because especially this is not the kind of subject which people feel comfortable online, right? Getting secret services together, where secret services also participated with their oversight authorities in a very...
These are one of the challenges we have now, right? Even more so, your mandate have been impacted, right? Because you can't do certain things online, or we move things online, but then there is the concomitant need of finding a way to protect that, right? We had
that is an additional dimension and difficulty which has been presented by the pandemic. But there are also inherent difficulties which may not be present in all mandates. So one of the problems that the mandate faces is that a lot of its work on surveillance and secret services needs to depend on reports which are officially in the public domain, right? So it's not as if I can turn up in London and tell the British government I want access to everything that MI5 or MI6 has. Far from it. MI5 and MI6 will meet with me, and very courteously they will explain their work, but obviously they too are bound to protect the official secrets of the UK government. And that being said, it is a very common practice that those countries, and not all, very few, which make public information about the operation of their secret services, do so with a considerable delay. So why? Because before it is made public, at least 2 or 3 government agencies, sometimes more, have to redact it and vet it. And then it is often, as in the United States, for example, submitted to a judge in a special court who looks at it further and redacts the public version further. So sometimes we are very often looking at reports which take at least 1, normally 2, sometimes 3 years to make it into the public domain. So I'm always very careful to state the date in my reports, because the events about which I may be reporting may be 2 or 3 years old, but I've only had them for 3 weeks, right? So this is something which is not happily not something all mandates have to deal with, but certainly in the mandate of privacy, insofar as surveillance is concerned, it's very important.
Yeah, that's a challenge, because this is a matter of national security for countries involved. As much as they want to collaborate, they have to be, careful of their staff.
Yes,
makes
yes,
sense. But at the same time, I was curious about the question of health privacy, right? The right to privacy in healthcare, in your medical records. I went to a conference last year, or maybe it was in end of 2019, at the University Hospital of Geneva, and they were discussing precisely this: that this very valuable data, medical records of patients who go through the university, college, medical schools system here in Switzerland. This data is accessed by all private sectors, and nobody's compensated. They benefit, they profit from this data, but the patients themselves don't even know that this data is being used. And this is very valuable. Not to say there is a matter of security, if the hospital is hacked, your data is exposed. So what kind of issues did you find in relation to medical data? Because in the United States, there is something called HIPAA, no? I think, I don't remember what the acronym means exactly, but it's something related to like a GDPR for medical records. Hospitals and doctors cannot just access your medical records. In Switzerland, it seems like this is slightly different, or at least they are doing things that the public is not aware. Did any of these issues came up in your reports?
I should say that all of those issues came out in my report. Um, and they are covered in various ways. First of all, HIPAA, which you referred to, I have also in my report on the country visit to the United States, openly declared that it is sorely out of date, right? So HIPAA is a product of the 1990s. It has not been adequately revised. It needs to be revised. And I should also point out that there's a huge difference in data handling traditions in the United States and in Europe. So in Europe, not only is there the GDPR, which is basically a much debated and discussed and upgraded version of all the data protection laws which have developed in Europe over the past 40 years and more. But also in Europe, there is a huge difference in the way, in the culture linked to medical data. So in the United States, and there are books which trace this very interestingly, in the United States, since about 1952, there has been a growing monetization of patient data. In other words, people realized very early on that the kind of medical data, and especially medications, etc., which are purchased in the United States, have a strong commercial value for pharmaceutical companies and other commercial entities for profit in the healthcare sector. Which means, strictly speaking, that the minute that you leave a pharmacy in the United States, you have barely stepped out of the door, if at all, but your data has already been sold to somebody else. In Europe, that practice is nowhere comparable to that in the United States. In Europe, as in the United States for other things, now I shall compare different things, when it comes to carrying out research with health data, that is normally quite a difficult process because it requires approval by several ethics committees within the hospital concerned. So it's not as if you go into any hospital and your data is immediately going to be passed on. No, indeed, on those occasions where, for example, a UK hospital made an agreement with Google to try and use patient data using AI, there was a big hoo-ha about it. And
Yes, I remember that. Like looking at macular degeneration, right?
Yes.
And they worked with the opticians as well.
Yes.
I know
So
because someone I know went to an optician, and the optician started doing all these exams about macular degeneration, and then he was like, "Why?" And then he found out later all this information was being compiled by Google in some sort of study again, but the patient was, his data was being used without any compensation, without any protection too. And again, it's the private sector getting its feet in public health systems, which the patients do not have a say.
well, we must be careful to qualify things here and qualify them properly, in the sense that in most cases that I know, most hospitals will actually ask patients to sign a consent form, especially if the data is going to be used for any form of research. And normally, in most cases, that data is only shared with the patient's consent, unless there is a law which specifically authorizes such data to be shared without the patient's consent. However, we should distinguish between compensation of patients and privacy. Compensation is quite a different matter because we are dealing with the pecuniary, with the financial compensation for any results obtained through the research, right? So that dimension can be handled quite independently from the ethical dimensions concerned, because compensation, there is an ethical dimension to compensation, but it's not the same, necessarily the same ethical dimension as privacy, right? And some research has shown that patients, unfortunately, are far too willing to consent to something, especially, and this is where patients themselves get very heated about it. Some patients, especially if they feel any form of anxiety or they really wish there to be a medical solution to their condition, some patients will sign anything, right?
Right. Sometimes with good intentions to contribute to science.
And this is what I'm saying, there are divided opinions on it. Some patients are far more careful, even if they have cancer, right? So it is very much a matter of individual choice here as to what information they want to spread among themselves. There is a problem, however, and if you'll permit me to leave a bit the medical issue for a minute to finish something I wanted to say about surveillance, because very clearly when it comes to surveillance, you must ask the question, do we have the political will, right? And at this moment in time, there are certain issues which cannot be resolved without the political will. I'll give you an example, Maya. For example, in many countries, there is not adequate local remedy. And that remedy can only be established through international agreements about the subject, in the same way as we had to establish international agreements in the law of the sea under the UN aegis. And that international agreement is a long way off. And I told the UN Human Rights Council in 2018, when I presented it with a draft legal instrument, I told them, look, we've spent 2.5 years drafting this legal instrument in consultation with NGOs, secret services, etc. But do you have the political will to do anything about it? And what I sense is no. And there are some countries which blatantly said no, and are recorded as such. Others didn't say so, but are even more against it than other countries, because the truth is, a number of countries continue to treat the internet like their backyard, where they can do whatever they like, whether it's espionage, whether it's surveillance, etc. And they are not very keen to have that discussed. They may say they're keen, they may hold meetings, but in reality, the political will is not there.